so much, Marilyn, for this really humbling opening. And I think for me, every time, perhaps I'll join Netta in acknowledging that we are gathered on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And the reason I wanted to reiterate that is that for me, the idea of custodianship is always, connected with the idea of care, as it reflects connection to natural entities that transcends legal borders or the legal recognition of sovereignty. And by acknowledging country, I think we also acknowledge the limitations of some of the formal legal institutions that we have, and I hope that our discussions here today will reflect care and creativity as we explore legal alternatives to war and possible solutions for legal harms. And that's the reason I'm so thrilled to have Omar Dajani with us today. I was just thinking, as I was thinking with Netta around the concepts for this conference today, I was really hoping we can perhaps transcend some of the technical legal debates our community has been having around violations of the law of war, perceived violations of particular, sections of the Geneva Convention, of the Hague Regulation. And what I was really hoping the opening speech by Omar will do today, what Omar always does for me, is really cheer me up, remind me that there is still hope if we are opening our minds to different solutions. And so instead of focusing on the technicalities of legal violations, I'm hoping that this will inspire us to think about alternatives to war, about pathways to peace, and about the creative and hopeful humans that are required to bring us there. So with that note, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Omar Dajani, who is the Carol Olson Professor of International Law at the McGeorge School of Law at the University of the Pacific in the US, where we originally met so many years ago. So Omar's scholarship explores how legal norms operate in the context of international conflict resolution processes and political transitions, and especially around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And with the horrific situation that we have been witnessing in the Middle East since October 23, I think this is a very timely moment to have Omar's hopeful and creative talk today. So I'll just note that among his recent publications are Federalism and Decentralization in the Contemporary Middle East and North Africa by Cambridge University Press from 2023. And I'll note, as I think this is particularly important for today's talk, that Omar served as legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team in the peace talks with Israel, participating in the summits at Camp David and Taba, and later as a political advisor in the Office of the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process in Jerusalem. And perhaps most importantly, he currently serves as co-chair of the joint board of A Land for All, which is an Israeli-Palestinian peace movement. There is so much more to tell about Omar, but you have his full biography, and I highly recommend that you look him up and see some of the amazing projects that he is involved with. So thank you so much for joining us today, Omar. I'm just hoping that this will... some reason, okay. Sorry.
Sometimes
it takes... Alicia, would you mind? Thanks. Okay. I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I don't know if you want to start without the slide, and then we can.
Sure. Yeah, I won't need the slides for a little bit. Yeah.
I think the Zoom kind of distracted. Okay, I'll call.
No worries. Well, thanks so much to you, Shiri, for inviting me to be here and for your continuing commitment over the years to ensuring that there is a robust and humane conversation about what's happening in Israel-Palestine and more broadly. And thanks so much also to Dean McMahon for hosting us here today, and to Netta and others for making this event happen. I'm really grateful for the chance to speak with you today. As Shiri mentioned, I worked as a young lawyer in what was then called the Middle East peace process, showing up in Ramallah in September of 1999, just after Ehud Barak had been elected Prime Minister of Israel. There was an expectation that we were about to make peace. There had been 3 difficult years of Benjamin Netanyahu's first term in office, during which the Oslo process had just about fallen off the rails. And with Barak's election, there was a sense that we were on again. And so it was with incredible excitement that we entered the negotiating rooms that fall and began conversations that were intended to go beyond interim arrangements, which had been the focus of negotiations for the previous 5 years, and move toward the big issues of what was called permanent status, whether there would be a Palestinian state, what its borders would be, what would be done with Israeli settlements in the occupied territory, how Palestinian refugees' fate would unfold, what would be done with the city of Jerusalem. Questions of incredible importance politically and emotionally to a lot of people on the ground, and questions of a lot of complexity. And so one of the things that arose very early on was the question of what frame we would be undertaking to decide these questions within. And there were 2 dimensions to that seem really relevant to the discussions that we'll be having over the course of the day today, and the focus on protection that is the central focus of today's discussion. The first was to what extent law informs, and in particular international law, should inform the disposition of the issues on the table. And the second broad question was, to what extent an idea that had begun taking shape in Israel over the previous 10 years, that peace was best achieved by maximizing physical separation or segregation between Palestinians and Israelis. To what extent would that guide how we were going to address the issues on the table? So the answer to the first question arose pretty quickly, pretty early in the talks. I remember in the first month of negotiations, one of the arguments we had was to what extent key legal norms would be reference points, would create a principled framework within which we would operate. The Israeli team said, we should not be having a conversation about law. We should just be having a conversation about the proposals that are on the table. Legal norms, they said, will distract us. They will take us away from the issues that we need to address. But after arguing about it a bit, they acquiesced in having a session at which we would discuss the role of norms in the negotiations that we were commencing. And so I thought my moment had arrived. I showed up with all of these binders that we had been preparing of the instruments that we thought were most clearly relevant. And my portfolio was borders and security, very small issues in that setting. And so my counterpart said, please, this is your agenda. Why don't you all begin the presentation? And so I began what ended up being a too-long disquisition on the applicability of international humanitarian law, and in particular of the Fourth Geneva Convention, on its implications with regard to Israeli settlements and how that related to the issue of borders that we were about to engage. And as I was getting to a long list of international actors who had affirmed the applicability of the Geneva Conventions in the occupied territory, the Security Council, the General Assembly, the International Commission of the Red Cross, my Israeli counterpart, Daniel Reisner, who was legal advisor to the IDF at that juncture and a lieutenant colonel in it, he interrupted me and he said, Omar, with respect, we don't care who thinks the Fourth Geneva Convention is applicable to the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The government of Israel does not consider it so. And unless you're prepared to take it to the Security Council, I think that that's where this conversation ends. And indeed, in a way, that is where that conversation ended. We, over the course of the following year, undertook again and again to incorporate legal norms into our advocacy of certain outcomes, and also to undertake a process of persuasion about why those norms dictated outcomes that were good for the parties, good for both parties. But that process veered toward a frame that the Clinton administration in the United States felt was more likely to be successful, of identifying in a bazaar-like fashion, B-A-Z-A-A-R, where one side's positions were, where the other side's positions were, and then trying to find a point somewhere in the middle where they could declare fairness presided. As you know, that process didn't end well. I got an email from my law school flatmate in January of 2001, after the Taba summit had collapsed, as the Palestinians' second intifada was raging in the West Bank and Gaza, and as Israel was responding to it with increasing ferocity. And my flatmate said, I wasn't sure that you would succeed, but I didn't expect you to fail so spectacularly. And some 24 years later, particularly over these last 16 months, the costs of that failure, its tragedy, have weighed on me increasingly. And so it's felt important to revisit the sources of our failure and to think about how we might do things differently. And I think that part of the conversation that has to be had is what fairness means in an international conflict resolution process like this, to what extent legal norms should be a reference point. But part of it is also whether the assumptions that we entered into this process with at that juncture about what peace looked like should continue to prevail. And it's on that that I will focus for the first few parts of this presentation. What I'll do is start off by describing what was a core assumption, which I've already alluded to, the idea that separation is a vehicle toward peace, and the impact that it had on imagination of outcomes with regard to what a two-state solution should be. I'll turn from that to suggesting an alternative, one that the movement that Shiri described earlier, a land for all, two states, one homeland, that I've been very involved with, has developed over thousands of hours of work between Palestinians and Israeli Jews from all across our common homeland. And then I'll touch on, if there's time, a few key lessons that I think we have to heed as an international community if we are to steer this process back in a direction that can yield positive results. And so, Shiri, just so that I'm sure about time, I have at this juncture 15, 20 minutes, something like that? 20 minutes. Okay, great. So I'll try to be quick with regard to those questions. So Ehud Barak, who, as I mentioned, was elected prime minister in 1999, his campaign slogan that won him the prime ministership, along with frustration with Bibi Netanyahu, declared, "Peace with Barak. We are here, they are there." The idea that was explicit in that slogan was that the best way to achieve peace was to minimize physical contact between Palestinians and Israelis. And that affected how many of the issues on the negotiating table would be addressed. And so the positions that Israel advocated at that juncture and that the US administration, the Clinton administration, supported, and ultimately that Palestinians acquiesced in, provided that, number one, that a border would be established between Israel and Palestine, that that border would be more wall than bridge, that Israeli settlements would, to as great an extent as possible, be annexed to Israel so that 80% of the settlers would become citizens of the state of Israel, would be on the Israeli side of the border. And because separation was the frame, the remaining settlers would be relocated from their homes back into Israel. That the city of Jerusalem, which is among the cities that people call mixed cities, which includes both Palestinian neighborhoods and Israeli Jewish neighborhoods, some of which are settlements because they are in occupied territory, that it would be divided and there would be effectively a border running through the city. And that Palestinian refugees, either folks who had fled or were expelled from their homes inside what became Israel in 1948, or their descendants, would potentially be able to become citizens of a state of Palestine, but would not be permitted to return to their homes in what's now Israel. So this was the overarching frame, with separation being the key idea running through the key three issues. The problem is that it was really difficult for us to agree on the terms of our separation as much as we wanted a divorce. And so you can see on the screen on the left a rough depiction of and one version of the map that the Israeli proposals, which were never actually presented at Camp David in map form, might yield as far as a revision of the border. And what you see on the left there is a map in which the Jerusalem area and large settlement blocks along the border end up being annexed. A map that Palestinians struggled with for a range of reasons, which I am happy to talk about later when we get to the question and answer period, but which included the implications with regard to the development potential of Palestinian territory, particularly in view of the overlay of that border and access to water resources, which was a critical part of the question. But this map, at the end of the day, produced a presumption that in order for a border to be drawn, it would have to be drawn in a way that involved large swaths of territory being annexed by Israel. And a large number of Israelis, some 80,000, being relocated from settlements inside the occupied territory to inside Israel. And you can see in this map where those settlements are located. And if you look at kind of the zoomed in image on the right, the settlements built up areas appear in dark blue. And the areas that they have claimed more broadly as zones in their urban plans for development appear in lighter blue. And you can see the scale of what has been developed on that front and the difficulty that it presents with regard to the relocation of the settlers there in political, economic, and security terms, remembering that these are home to some of the most extreme communities in the Israeli polity. And so one of the challenges that separation presented was this one. Where you draw the border in a way that doesn't destroy Palestinian interests with regard to developing a viable state, and that doesn't doom an Israeli government politically because of opposition from this vocal group. A second difficult question, as I alluded to earlier, was what happens to Palestinian refugees? And you can see on the left side, the left map, the places from which those refugees hail. And the difficulty presented there, again, is that these are the places that Palestinian refugees consider home. And so what a separation-based framework requires is that the refugee communities relocated, as you can see on the right, to places like Lebanon, Syria, the West Bank and Gaza Strip, Jordan, would be obliged not to return to the places that they consider a home, but instead to this other state. And then finally, you can see here what the city of Jerusalem looks like and the difficulty that is presented in running a border through it. On the map, you can see East Jerusalem's revised municipal borders with Israeli settlements in blue and Palestinian neighborhoods in green. And again, the challenge that is presented here when you try to run a border through it is, in light of how interlocking these neighborhoods are, who gets right of way? Now, the culmination of separation thinking, I think, is reflected in the peace plan that Donald Trump devised 20 years after the negotiations in which I was involved. And what you can see from the map that Trump and Kushner put forward was the idea that what separation means is a barely contiguous Palestinian state surrounded in all directions by areas controlled by Israel, and in a regime in which movement across Palestinian areas would be constantly precarious. So it's with that in mind that I'd like to turn to the concept that has been developed over this last 10 years as a response to this approach. And the movement that I have been involved with, Two States, One Homeland, also called A Land for All, stands for the proposition that the border between Israel and Palestine should indeed be the focus of our attention. But rather than focusing on where it is, though that's an important question, we've got to be focused on what kind of border it is. And so let me elaborate a little bit on the basic premise of this alternative two-state solution. And so we start from the premise that two states in this tiny country are crucial, even though it is a small space. And that it's crucial because we're not yet, Israelis and Palestinians, in a post-national moment, that people are still, in both communities, attached to national identity. And as a consequence, mutual self-determination is really important. And so we advocate the establishment of a Palestinian state uh, with a border based upon the June 4th, 1967 border. And this alternative map, which is advocated by some members of the Israeli peace movement, what's called the Geneva Initiative, which involves some small revisions to the border and land exchanges, might give one indication of what such a border might be in this framework. But that's where our approach differ. It's beyond that where our approach differs so much from the long-standing one. And let me just highlight three key features of difference. So first of all, the border would be regulated and defined, but over time, with due concern for both people's security and for the economies of both states, it would become a border that is more like the border between France and Germany than like the border between North and South Korea. A border over which there is freedom of movement and freedom of residence for all Palestinians and all Israeli Jews. And this provides a means of addressing not only the issue of borders, but also for addressing the other issues that I've just highlighted. Israeli settlers, rather than being relocated out of their homes in the West Bank and hopefully not again in the Gaza Strip, but rather than being relocated from their homes, could remain in them as permanent residents of a state of Palestine. They would vote in national elections in the state of Israel, but would vote in local elections in the state of Palestine. In that respect, the regime is very much like the one that's been established in the Schengen area in Europe. Palestinian refugees, similarly, would become citizens of a state of Palestine and vote in national elections there, but would have the opportunity to vote in local elections in Israel, where they could become permanent residents. And in the framework that we've developed over time, one of the dimensions that we've explored is how to think about refugee repatriation in both individual and collective terms, how you ensure that refugees returning to their homes, their places of origin, return to communities of which they can be part rather than communities that they would be alienated from, drawing on the growing body of practice from the Balkans and other places about how to manage this humanly. And then Jerusalem would be a shared city with freedom of movement within it, and in most circumstances to it, but regulation of movement to it in circumstances of emergency challenges. Now, I am mindful that I'm just about out of time, and so I'm going to make one last point and save some of these other remarks for a little bit later on, if we have time. When you look at this reimagination of a two-state solution, it's easy to turn first to questions of security and to ask how, in a scenario that is emerging from the scale and gravity of conflict, can move to a regime of freedom of movement. And indeed, whether a regime of freedom of movement can even be the basis for security in such a place. And here's where I really want to stress one point, which is that the long-standing approach to promoting security in Israel-Palestine has been one premised on fragmentation of territory and authority as a means of achieving security. Breaking the territory into lots of small places, creating security cordons around them, and using that as a means of promoting security for one of the national groups in this space, that is, Israeli Jews. And it's not only a problem because it doesn't take seriously Palestinians' need for security, as we can see so horrifically on display, not only in the Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank, where some 40,000 people have been displaced just in the last few weeks. But it also has been an abject failure. If we look on the one hand at the place where freedom of movement and residence has prevailed, which is inside Israel, where some 2 million Palestinians live as citizens, alongside their Israeli Jewish neighbors, where they work alongside each other in hospitals and in restaurants, where they drive alongside each other on highways, and in many cases live alongside each other. Security problems have been minor over these last 75 years. In contrast, the single place in the country where there has been the most securitized border, a billion-dollar fortified wall with a huge investment in separation, the Gaza Strip, that has been the locus of 5 wars plus whatever we want to characterize the current conflict in Gaza as. And so, with a view toward having just at least a few minutes for any questions that you've got, I'll stop there. But I want to urge you, if you're interested in learning more, this QR code will give you a link to our website. And I'd also be very glad to speak about any of what I've just described, and or to talk about some of the things that can be done now to build a bridge from the terrible place that we've arrived at to this kind of future. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Omar, for this fantastic opening for our conference. Let's open for Q&A, both from Zoom or in the room. If anyone have any questions, just raise your hand and the microphone will reach you. Jeremy?
Omar, thanks for the fantastic presentation. I've had the chance to have a look briefly at the outline of the proposal, and as a piece of constitutional legal policy. Thank you. It's a fantastic piece of work and very interesting. I'd be really intrigued, as you suggested, to hear a bit more about the bridge that you see from here. This is perhaps the obvious question to where this type of solution could be acceptable to both polities, and that's something that you've acknowledged already today as being really essential.
Right.
It reminds me a bit of solutions that were in vogue before the Second Intifada, and indeed is reminiscent of the situation, before the border wall was erected, when there was, largely freedom of movement between all of the territories, and there are obvious, security reasons from the Israeli perspective as to why those changes were implemented. So very keen to hear your views on how we can move to something a bit more significant.
Would you introduce yourself?
Oh, apologies. Yes, Jeremy Shelley, Office of International Law at the Attorney General's Department.
Okay, great. Should I collect questions, or should I go and respond to Jeremy?
Maybe we can collect 2 more. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Omar, and apologies if you said this already, but given the remarks you made about the strong sense of nationality on both sides and therefore the need for self-determination, I wondered if there had been any thought to notions of dual citizenship of a overarching body politic of which both would be subsidiaries. I'm sure that's been thought of before, but I wondered if you had any reaction to that. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Daniela. I'm Piper. I'm from the National Security College at ANU.
Yeah, Marika. And then the first round.
Hi, Marika Sosnowski from the University of Melbourne. Thanks for the talk, Omar. It's heartening even just to have people imagining otherwise at this point in time. So thank you. I guess my question builds on the last one a little bit, and I'm sure it probably, says what Shuri has already said to you in conversations, is I think from what we see, I don't think the Israeli government agrees with you in terms of, I mean, its stance is that separation does equal peace, is its best form of security. And I think it's prepared to sort of wear, 7th of October acts or whatever acts come in the future, because that's this idea of separation is what it sees as the best route towards security, let's say peace in Israelis / the government's mind.
Great, thank you. Shall I go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, first of all, with regard to the bridge, there are three kinds of things that I think we have to work through, struggle with. The first is really thinking through how to design a process for rebuilding and rehabilitating the Gaza Strip that bears in mind some of the lessons that we've learned in the past about how problematic a frame of separation can be with regard to its both political and economic future. So being a little bit more concrete, when we look at the last 5 wars that were prosecuted in between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, after each one of them, there was a real commitment to the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip. And as a consequence of the restrictions that Israel has imposed on movement of both persons and goods, in each one of those cases, what we saw was that the Gaza Strip's isolation deepened and that the ability to actually rebuild was incredibly circumscribed. And so what we are advocating is to take decisions about questions like Gaza's reconstruction with a view toward starting from the end and reverse engineering a process from there. So rather than taking the approach that was long advocated by Dennis Ross, among others, which is to say, let's just think about what's possible now. Let's think instead about a vision that is seriously responsive to both people's rights and needs, and then try along the way to take decisions about the discrete policy choices that arise consistent with that. So vis-a-vis Gaza, as we look, for example, at the Arab League plan that seems to be probably will be on the table next week, one of the really crucial questions, there are 2 crucial questions that I think will come up there. One of them is to what extent Gaza will be there'll be an attempt to connect Gaza economically and politically to Egypt to continue its isolation from the West Bank and Israel. And one of the questions, a related question, will be what the role of the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian state, an alternative frame for action there, would be. And so one of the things that we've been pushing hard is to recognize that even though it may be faster to rebuild Gaza if you are linking it to Egypt rather than attempting to link it back to the Gaza Strip, back to the West Bank, that approach will have really problematic long-term consequences. So part of building a bridge for us to this concept is thinking about each of these policy choices with long-term outcomes in mind. Part of it is really focusing on an ultimate vision and working backwards. And then the last piece is thinking seriously about incentives with regard to process design. And I'll say just one thing on this front. One of the biggest problems with the Oslo process was the fact that Palestinians were in a position where there was very little that they could give Israel in exchange for the things that they were seeking from Israel. And so the incentives for continuing forward with regard to the commitments that Israel has made, prisoner releases or a redeployment out of territory, and ultimately, with regard to the contours of a peace settlement, we're small. And so one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about is how you design a process going forward that is attuned to Israel's incentives, and the difficulty of maintaining forward momentum without them. And what polling in Israel suggests, and this is to some extent also responsive to America's question, is that whereas Israeli Jews are at this juncture quite a bit less supportive of a two-state outcome than they were even 2 years ago, with support in the 30% zone. When pollsters and really reliable polls, Dalia Schendlin on the one hand, INSS on the other, where they paired a two-state frame with a regional security framework, support shot up to some 60%. And so we've been in conversations with the Saudis about how to pace their steps toward normalization with Israel in order to ensure that it can actually create a virtuous cycle rather than doing what the UAE did, which was to remove an incentive that was really valuable for forward progress. And to the extent that they continue down that careful path, which they seem inclined to do because of the desire also to maintain the thawing relations with Iran that they've built, that seems like another useful bridge. But I'll say that it's just a really, really difficult enterprise. And I think that's where the international community has to really be careful to distinguish between what is in Israel's long-term interest from the short-term appeal of leaving Israelis feeling that their security concerns are front and center of efforts to address forward steps. Just really quickly, with regard to Daniela's question, so we have a joint project, my university and University College London, which is a 3-year project that we've just begun, called the Shared Homeland Paradigm. And one of the clusters of questions that we're looking at is the relationship between citizenship, residency, and mobility, thinking about the clusters of rights that would be associated with each of them. And one of the issues that has come up is the question of dual citizenship. And whereas one of the assumptions behind our frame is that Palestinian citizens of Israel would remain citizens of Israel, there is a possibility that Palestinian citizens of Israel could become dual citizens. For others, it's a hard question, and I'll end here. And it's a question about how you strike a balance between a paradigm that is at a meta level responsive to the need for mutual self-determination and that says that Israel, for example, will remain a Jewish state insofar as it will continue to have a Jewish voting majority, right? Because Palestinians who become permanent residents of the state of Israel would not be able to vote in Israeli national elections, right? So how do you maintain Jewish self-determination? And conversely, how do you do that for Palestinians without this divide? And on the other hand, going from the meta level to the question of individual rights, how you ensure that people on each side of the border who are in minority communities have voice and have access to political decisions that are relevant to their lives. And so the way that we've struck that balance is through the distinction between national and local governance participation. But we also recognize that what we can, the unintended consequence could be creating a class of permanent residents over many generations in a way that looks uncomfortably too much like the UAE. So they're hard questions, but we're working on them. I'll stop there. Thank you.